This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London. All of our podcasts are available from our website, www.sas.ac.uk.
Makes sense, and if I don't, I apologise. Funny enough, Stacey, in your introduction, you mentioned that I do quite a lot of stuff on the Gothic, and since writing my abstract for this, I was thinking about the Gothic quite a bit. So actually, I am going to be talking a little bit about that in terms of Gothic heroine in a moment. I'm aware that we don't have too much time, so as I said in my abstract, I think one of the most discussed features of Buffy, and it was discussed a lot for many different topics, academically and non-academically, is a representation of Buffy as its central heroine, the female protagonist. Now, whether that's kind of, how much that's to do with Whedon or the whole group of writers as it turned out as the series progressed, I think is a big can of worms, and I'm not going to dwell on that. But I guess what I'm thinking about is the legacy of Whedon in terms of the representation of women on screen. So it's not strictly true to say that the TV series changed the face of female representation. I think it did a lot, but as you can see, there are lots of examples of the action heroine on screen. We've got Hunger Games, people like, obviously there's Buffy, Xena, Ripley is quite an early example. There's lots of different examples of an action heroine on screen. Although I think sort of Buffy is quite a prime example of what's often called the kind of post-femme action heroine, and one that has a great deal of humour on her side, which arguably not many of the others do. So I thought I'd think about this idea of sort of heroism and characters in later Whedon shows, although I think I'm going to concentrate completely on River, actually, mainly in Serenity, because it's easier for a short paper. So obviously, in terms of Buffy, there's this kind of girl heroes legacy, which is quite a sort of TV phenomenon, I think. And I think sort of people like Bonko and O'Reilly have talked about girl heroes in terms of how they have to prove their worthiness, which is usually to do with things like trials. That's quite classic sort of testing of heroism throughout fiction, generally. I think sort of the other aspect is that there's a whole kind of aspect with lots of girl sort of heroes on screen about bowing down to authority. So O'Reilly argues that male superheroes, for example, are much less likely to do something like that, whereas female superheroes do tend to have some kind of authority over them. Buffy's obviously got the Watcher's Council, although she does renounce it later on, and actually they get blown up, don't they? So. And actually, if I find Serenity, there is Mal, who does run the ship, he's the captain of the ship, and certainly with Zoe, he completely kind of rules the roost, and she's very sort of subservient to him in terms of hierarchy and rank. River, on the other hand, I think is, she just sort of avoids Mal's authority, I think, in many ways, and I think that's what makes her quite interesting. So anyway, moving on. Just about this, there's a whole bunch of stuff. I mean, Tasker talks about these kind of action heroines and the fact that women action heroines on screen often need some kind of excuse to behave in the way that they do. Her prime example is motherhood. I think that's a fairly well-trodden field, so I'm not going to dwell on that any further. So like I said, I thought I'd turn to the Gothic and see if we could find something interesting in relation to Whedon's later creations after Buffy. Buffy obviously has quite obvious Gothic leanings. So the classic kind of aspects of the Gothic heroine is that she must journey somewhere dark and unknown. There is some kind of wilderness, wild landscape where she finds herself. She has to deal with some kind of supernatural threat. Usually she braves this and is curious about it, so she sort of seeks it out, essentially. And usually there's some kind of past haunting the present as well. And I'm really sort of simplifying that, but just for time reasons I thought that's what I'd think about. So like I said, she's kind of driven by curiosity, the Gothic heroine, and many Gothic heroines negotiate kind of a slippery line between ideological instruction and the mediation of the female experience. And I think that's kind of where Buffy's legacy perhaps lies, in this sort of particular area. Obviously, they feature the supernatural and some sort of secretive past. Usually there's some kind of recognisable monstrous figures, etc. as well. The other thing I find particularly interesting about the Gothic is landscape. And I thought this was sort of on the surface a bit of a clunky association with something like Serenity. And the more I looked at it and the more I thought about it, which I think is why it occurred to me in the first place, it does seem to me to be an incredibly Gothic landscape, even though it's not kind of traditionally one, being kind of, in generic terms, a Western based in space. So I think kind of there's, the ship, Serenity itself is quite gloomy, which you can see with the shot with Mal there. And then there's also this sense of the wilderness in space as well. So generally, in such landscapes, heroines find themselves in quite dangerous territory. On discussing traditional Gothic landscapes, such as dark forests, mountains, terrain, moorlands and violent seas, Emma and James McElroy suggest, they're actually talking Twilight, that it's amidst such alluring topographies, whether wilderness or other, that the Gothic and like-minded fictions prepare their ecological narratives so that nature and culture, as suppositional binaries, can come into play. So we get all these kind of interplays between things like nature and culture, and the civilised and the uncivilised, and those kind of binaries. So I thought in light of that, I'd just have a think about Serenity, really. So first of all, in terms of River, as a kind of Gothic heroine, I just thought I'd say a few things about her, and then just a little bit about the Gothic landscape as well. There's obviously there's elements of the supernatural in Serenity. It's not sort of completely at the forefront as it is in something like Buffy, obviously as well with all the vampires and other demons that arise throughout the series. But the supernatural sort of plays its part in the Reavers, who are originally human, a bit like vampires, etc., but have been they're sort of often referred to as rotting from the inside, and they've kind of been poisoned by gas that's made them incredibly aggressive, and they're cannibalistic and completely sort of bereft of any sort of civilised or social graces, if you like. They have no, they're id figures, basically, I guess. So River, more than anybody else, is haunted by these, and that's because she has, she's sort of psychic, and she's been manipulated by the Alliance and given all these kind of subliminal messaging, etc. So she has memories that are not her own, and that's primarily played out through the Miranda storyline, which is this planet where the Reavers were originally poisoned. Everybody else just laid down to die because they were so peaceful. So some members of the population became very peaceful with this gas poison, and the others went the other way, completely aggressive. So River's haunted by this, and I think actually sort of interestingly, if you're thinking about it through the lens of the Gothic, she's not curious, actually. She doesn't want to know, and she says specifically to Simon at one point that these are not her memories, and she shouldn't have to carry them. She doesn't want them. So she's definitely much more inhibited, I guess, than your classic Gothic heroine, who is driven usually by her curiosity. But she is ultimately haunted by these memories that are not her own, and she's also haunted by her own past. And that's played out in lots of ways. So there's the scenes of her memories of being at school, and clearly they're not real memories, they're manipulated memories. They've been walked through time, and also through her dealings with the Alliance. So she's a character that is played out as not completely engrasped with her sanity, I guess, and she's actually sort of her reality is tainted on a daily basis by these memories that are not actually hers. So she's quite an interesting character. Like I said, she's reluctant, but particularly in Serenity, where they've obviously, because Firefly was cancelled, Serenity, they pull out the storyline much more strongly. And her kind of heroism plays a much bigger part in the film than it does, I think, in the TV series. So her heroism is interesting because it kind of mirrors Mal's. And Mal kind of plays a very classic kind of male Western sort of hero figure. But her fight scenes often mirror his, so particularly at the end when Mal is dealing with the assassin, when he's trying to get the message out to the population. Sorry, I hope you've seen the film, otherwise it's really confusing. And River's fight scene mirrors that when she deals with the Weavers in a kind of massacre scene, if you like. And those are part of her trials, which prove her heroism throughout the film, if you like. Just in terms of the Gothic landscape, that's just some of River's kind of fight scenes. Interesting, she's also a dancer, so her fight scenes are very balletic, which kind of remind me of Buffy's fight scenes, but they're sort of quite different as well. So the Gothic landscape, like I said, River has memories at the beginning of being at school, and her teacher talks to, this plays out as sort of narrative background for the viewer, obviously, but the teacher talks to the children about how the alliance came to be, and it's framed within the civilised pitted against the uncivilised. So the alliance is aligned with everything that is civilised in society. Anything outside of that, so the rebellion, and obviously people like the Reavers, are aligned with the uncivilised. Now that kind of lends itself to this kind of idea in the Gothic landscape of the wild and the wilderness, where there are some aspects that are outside of the sort of social acceptable and outside of the civilised, and aligned with this wilderness, and certainly this sort of outer edge of space, which is where the Reavers are kind of float around essentially. That is where we find this kind of wild terrain, even though it's not actually terrain. And like I said, the inside of Serenity is the other aspect where we see this quite interesting Gothic landscape. And actually it's quite reminiscent of Alien in some ways. It's filmed with lots of blue tints and some neo-noir kind of lighting. Alien's kind of a bit more green in terms of its aesthetic. But it does, for example, scenes like this, which are more frequent, tend to contrast with sort of the coziness of Inara's shuttle and those kind of things, or sometimes when they're having dinner and it's lit in a much warmer light as well, and it throws up the darker sort of aesthetic of the inside of Serenity as it is generally shot. So those are sort of just some thoughts I had about Serenity and a little bit of Firefly as well, just in terms of these sort of Gothic ideas, or framework of the Gothic, if you like. And I think if there is a sort of legacy of Whedon, and like I said, I'm not really sure that there is, I think it's a bit problematic, but perhaps some of those Gothic elements of Buffy, which perhaps are the strongest elements of the show, in terms of its heroine and those other kind of Gothic elements. It's funnily enough, they've kind of been refracted in an interesting way through a different kind of genre bending, like Serenity in the Western space.
Thank you very much for a really interesting paper. We'll move right along to the next presenter is Professor Matthew Pateman from Kingston University. Most Buffy scholars will be familiar with Matthew's book on the Buffy Vampire Slayer. He's currently, you may not want me to mention this, but he's currently working on a book on Joss Whedon. And yes, you're going to finish it. If it kills me about pushing you to finish it, you're going to finish it. So I think he's got some really exciting things to say about Joss Whedon across his career. So he'll be speaking to us today on a paper entitled A Networked Whedon.
Evening. My book on Joss Whedon is currently, I think, 2 years overdue. Which is handy because it meant that I will get to write about all the stuff that's happened in the last year, so it's really a purposeful design.
Exactly.
And that's what Whedon. In some ways, I think that the notion that there's a legacy, a Whedonian legacy, is should be problematized, shouldn't be difficult. But there are ways in which I think you can argue that the presence of Whedon is felt each and every day in the US TV context in a sort of peculiarly, oddly bastardized anagram, or acronym, which I'll come to in a minute. But in order to go beyond Buffy, we have to return to Buffy for a second. At the height of its glory in season 5, the production company, Fox, understandably and in normal kind of practice, decided to raise the license fee from about $1 million per episode to nearly $2 million per episode. WB, who had been paying $1 million per episode up to that point, said it didn't want to pay it anymore, or at least the CEO of WB, Jen Kellner, said he didn't want to pay it. And he cited 2 or 3 reasons. One, he said Buffy wasn't their best show, or their biggest show. 2, the demographic that Buffy had been employed to get, the teen market, which was no longer the case. The demographic was now much more kind of mid-late 20s. And that they would be prepared to spend $1.6 million per episode, but that was it, they wouldn't go any further. Whedon was not happy. He thought that, one, it might not be the best-selling, the most viewed show, but it's certainly the most critically acclaimed show. 2, the demographic of Buffy since the 2nd season had been the mid-20s to early 30s, and that it wasn't so much a demographic age group, it was the portion of taste groupings that was the important aspect. And thirdly, $1.6 million, though the most WB had ever paid, wasn't enough because they needed $2 million. So, as everybody knows, Buffy moved from WB to UPN. And this itself created an incredibly kind of ferocious set of arguments about what was going to take place here, because the Fox owned parts, the parent company of Fox owned parts of the parent company of UPN, and there was a suggestion that there was double dealing or what's called self-dealing taking place. So Fox produces a show, sells it to a senior competitor, but actually reaps its own benefits. There's a whole kind of industry-shaking set of difficulties which persisted for quite some time. Obviously, CBS, ABC, NBC weren't taken on because, despite the critical acclaim, the actual figures simply wouldn't justify those huge networks taking it. Fox decided that they didn't want it, so UPN took it on board. This presented a huge difficulty. WB and UPN, to that point, the 2 newest fledgling networks in the US, had both fought for different aspects of the same age group, the same kind of mid-teens to mid-20s, early 30s age group. WB had gone for kind of relatively high-end drama, looking for a certain kind of taste category of individual who had a lot of money in one direction. UPN had gone for the sort of more teenage boy market, for wrestling and so on. At a stroke, these 2 competitor institutions which were nevertheless able to sort of share a demographic became competitors with the exact same demographic. It's no surprise, I mean I wouldn't want to overstate the case of Buffy and Whedon, but it's no surprise that within 2 or 3 years of the WB taking on, losing Buffy and UPN taking Buffy on, thereby sharing its demographic, that they collapsed. And that's merged into the CW. And there's the acronym, CW, cause Whedon. Whedon, every day in America, is sort of writ large in the TV schedule in some ways. Now, the CW is an extraordinary kind of hybrid monster from these 2 parent companies, which actually in many respects is much more like WB was than it is like the UPN. And this became very manifest recently when Whedon's the second contribution I want to talk about in relation to Whedon was sort of, there was a logical conclusion to his next most innovative aspect. On the 17th of October this year, UPN broadcast, anybody know what UPN broadcast on the 17th of October this year? Dr. Horrible Singing on Blog. Now, Dr. Horrible Singing on Blog, of course, came around because of the writer's strike of 2007-2008. And Whedon, being the kind of ferocious workaholic that he is, just couldn't abide to sit by doing nothing. So, as any self-respecting genius would, he decided to write the most innovative web show ever. Which is not to say that there hadn't been web shows before. I mean, partly he got the idea, well, he didn't get the idea from, but he took a lot of the expertise from Fisher Day and how to work on the Guild. But what he was able to do was, with a relatively modest budget, and there is a huge caveat here, not everybody, of course, has even a relatively modest budget that Whedon has to work with. And relatively modest still goes into hundreds of thousands of dollars. So this is not a template for your budding sort of filmmaker in the middle of Scarborough to kind of suddenly make a huge webisode. But it is taking on board certain kinds of industry-recognized standards in terms of production and writing and actor and so on and so forth. bringing these people together and doing something which he himself has described as, quite rightly, reinventing models of distribution and reinventing models of pay. And given that the entire strike was about the pay aspect, I think Whedon's contribution to how we might, or how Hollywood is trying to refigure structures of distribution and structures of remuneration is quite important. Whedon was able to not just create his own production company, or to use his own production company to create this great thing, but in so doing, he forced the Writers Guild and the actors' unions to invent new methods of paying people, because there was simply no way to kind of work through the process. So the fact of Dr. Horrible, I think, is potentially, I would argue, even more than Buffy, going to be, in years to come, seem to be Whedon's single greatest contribution to moving image culture, because of the way in which one made a huge number of people fantastically aware of the capacity of the internet to be a very high quality, high-end provider of moving image drama, comedy, musical, as you want to call it, but also because of the way in which it demonstrated that you don't have to be tied to the industry standards. There are other models that can be used. I'll mention briefly, as an aside, that I went to the micro studio Bellwether, which has produced and created the Much Ado About Nothing, who is in a very similar kind of model. He's produced in the micro studio Bellwether, something not dissimilar to what he did with the Dr. Horrible side of things, in terms of structures and distribution and remuneration. The other thing about Dr. Horrible, of course, was it did present the web as a very viable source, both of high quality drama and, most importantly, if we're going to be serious about what it means to make television, monetization. Whedon was able to monetize the web in a way that nobody had done before, and nobody has done subsequently. You've got some very interesting stuff taking place, like Husbands by Jane Estenson, but nobody has managed to get the same kind of level of monetization out of it. Partly, of course, that's Whedon's brand. Whedon is now such a huge brand, he could, and does routinely, he could have just put up little 2-minute slots, and I think I do want to talk about this in a minute, kind of how he sort of self-reflexively talks about himself, the recent zombie thing, was a fantastic demonstration about how somebody is able to use their brand to sort of engage in such a public discourse. Well, I'll leave that to one side, but so what you get with, I would argue, one of the most important legacies that we may be argued to have presented is the way in which, either inadvertently, for example, through the WB and UPN saga, or purposefully, if accidentally, through what he's done with Dr. Horrible, or having got himself in a position of being arguably one of the 5 or 6 biggest producer, director, writers in the Hollywood scheme with Bellwether, he is constantly challenging from within the system. He isn't a radical, he isn't a revolutionary, he is a member, he's a paid-up member of the Hollywood Club. But within being a paid-up member of the Hollywood Club, he is trying to find different ways, different niches, different avenues for distribution, monetization, and remuneration, providing different niches, different opportunities for creative individuals with a significant amount of spare capital to work outside of the systems, which can then be used to feed into that creation. And whilst I think you're right, it's a question of validity of a Whedon legacy. If there is one, I think it might be seen in years to come as being that, as much as or more than perhaps the creations that he produced. Okay.
Thank you very much. Moving right along, I'm pleased to introduce someone I work quite closely with, Lorna Jowett from Northampton University. Lorna and I'm going to do a shameless plug here. We've just co-written a book on called TV Horror, Investigating the Dark Side of the Small Screen, soon to be in your bookstores in the new year. So watch this space. And for the Whedon scholars, Lorna has written about, I could say probably almost every element of Whedon corruption, apart from Dr. Horrible. And but is probably most well known for her book Sexless Slayer, and will be talking to us today. A paper titled "Victor and Sierra Give Me Hope That True Love Exists: Interrogating Romance in Dollhouse." Watch for the eye rolling.
Yeah, so I'm going to read, because otherwise I can't keep to time, and Matthew, Stacey and Mike have heard this rant before, so apologies, you're going to have to sit through the eye rolling again. Okay, I'm kind of assuming you've all seen Dollhouse. You've all seen Dollhouse, yeah, great, because I'm not going to explain it. When I was researching Dollhouse, I found this fantastic picture online. Victor and Sierra give me hope that true love exists.
Joss Whedon creations have consistently interrogated the myth of heterosexual romance. Buffy and Angel negotiated romance from different angles, whether that was about characters growing up and changing their ideas about romance and sexuality, or whether it was what you can get away with in a fantasy show about vampires. Firefly featured a happily married couple and a sex worker, neither commonplace in network TV drama. And then there's Dollhouse, where almost all of the characters are either prostitutes or pimps. Melissa Milovich and Sharon Kay suggest that Buffy owes much of its popularity to making erotic love a dominant theme. Dollhouse may owe its lack of popularity to the way it treats the same theme in a more disturbing fashion. In Dollhouse, clients rent romantic and sexual fantasies embodied by a doll, and romance becomes prostitution. As Cynthia Masson points out, this led some viewers to read the show as brutally misogynistic. Since the dolls have new identities downloaded for each new engagement, Dollhouse puts gender and sexuality and romance as social construction and as performance front and centre. Obviously, the show's premise also means that character development doesn't work in the usual ways. And one means of encouraging audience identification beyond echo is the romantic connection between Victor and Sierra. This relationship humanises the dolls and creates sympathetic characters. It also suggests that they retain some form of essential identity, since this romance manifests between Priya and Tony as well as Sierra and Victor. These two are the only characters for whom romance remains relatively untarnished, and the relationship provides hope in the dystopian atmosphere of the show. So I'm going to talk about Sierra and Victor's essential connection in the context of genre and how it affects the show's negotiation of subjectivity and free will. Jan Johnson Smith talks about the way that science fiction generally foregrounds background, so that features that in other genres might remain background details supporting a story that unfolds in the foreground, in science fiction become the stuff that tells us that this is science fiction and that often become the story. So, you know, the LA house is constructed partly through its set design, through tech of the chair and the pods and so on. But I'm going to suggest that Victor and Sierra's relationship also functions as a kind of background and foreground, contributing to the show's negotiation of heterosexual romantic myth. These two characters are often in the background or on the periphery of a scene, but they serve a key purpose in the construction of the show. Dollhouse poses questions about technology, humanity, fantasy, reality, identity, subjectivity, corporate society, power of all kinds. There's been already detailed scholarship on these aspects, but I think the questions the show asks about romance are equally fascinating. And some of these questions include: is romance the fantasy and love the real? Is love selfish? Do soulmates exist? And obviously I can't answer these questions. So more specifically, in relation to Victor and Sierra, how is Victor's response to Sierra any different to the other male obsessions in the show? Does the apparent innocence of their love suggest that society is the problem with romance? And does the notion that Sierra and Victor are soulmates rule out free will? So, is Victor's response to Sierra any different to other male obsessions? Dollhouse clients, especially in season 1, are generally obsessive heterosexual men. Some, like Joe Minor, are presented sympathetically. Others, like Alpha, are shown to be capable of change. Most shed light on Paul's obsession with Caroline. So is Victor's love for Sierra, every time I say that I'm going to go, is Victor's love for Sierra the same or different? Well, you might say Victor's love is innocent. It contrasts the corrupted versions of love supreme touted by other male characters. The first evidence of Victor's feelings for Sierra is physical, Topher's man reaction. Given the narrative arc that continues into the next episode, Victor's sexual interest in Sierra allows for some confusion about who's abusing her in Dollhouse. But the narrative eventually reinforces that Victor's feelings are innocent, while other male characters are not. But it's notable that people tend to cite Victor's love for Sierra, not Sierra's love for Victor. So like many of the obsessive males depicted across the seasons, his love is rather one-sided. It's Priya who confesses her feelings for him, not Sierra, and that's not till season 2. Several commentators note Victor's passivity. And is it only this that prevents him from pressing his attentions on Sierra? We don't want to think so. But can there be such a thing as a good obsession? Is this what we mean by love? If it is, it's no wonder it's hard to tell the difference between real love, myths of romance, and abuses of power. When Echo marries in vows, the audience, I was at a wedding reception a couple of weeks ago, when Echo marries in vows, the audience is aware that this stereotypical perfect wedding day is not real. And I know people who would sigh with delighted pleasure at an image like this. I wouldn't. Reading comments that the whole show demonstrates that everything that was sweet was kind of creepy. Victor wants to pretend, Sierra tells Dr. Saunders in Man in the Street, he pretends we're married. Creepy. Perhaps this folding together of creepy and sweet partially accounts for the contradictory ways that writers, creators and viewers talk about romance and Dollhouse. On the DVD commentary to Belonging, Jed Whedon uses friendship to describe Sarah and Victor's relationship. But a little later, Marissa Tanchoran calls it true love. Given the apparent innocence of Victor's feelings, it's not surprising that we never see Sierra and Victor in a sexual scene, despite his mad reactions. During the attic, Victor's nightmare transforms sex with Anthony into abuse from Nolan, whom she stabs. This takes place in a dream space. It features Anthony and Priya, not Victor and Sierra. It's fairly overt here that something sweet turns into something creepy. That's partly what the attic does. As a doll, Victor's feelings might seem to be more authentic than other emotional or sexual connections because they don't rely on social context or performance of social roles. So this is moving now to the second question. Is society to blame for the myths, the problems attendant on the myth of heterosexual romance? Memory wipes were integral to plots in Buffy and Angel, but in those cases the love that persisted regardless of memory loss was born between sisters Buffy and Dawn or parent and child Angel and Connor. Dollhouse has a more difficult task asking whether love can be shorn of the myth of heterosexual romance. Can you wipe away a soul? One of the answers is there is no soul. This is just physical. Victor and Sierra's connection is just physical. Tom Connolly and Shelley S. Reese note the way the dolls are compared to animals. Remember bison, free-range chickens, veal. These descriptions are entirely religiously distasteful, especially by the second season. We've come to know individual dolls as individuals. To describe the tabula rasa dolls as animals is an obvious way to dehumanise them. It's got a long history of slavery and oppression in terms of discourse and language, including background scenes where dolls engage in artistic activities as well as physical ones offers a counterbalance to this animal instinct. Science fiction has a long history of showing aesthetic appreciation as well as emotion as something that distinguishes us as self-conscious, intelligent life. And the suggestion that without memories and social identity we're just animals also threatens Western society's valued notions of individuality and free will. We're not too comfortable with the idea of the dolls as just bodies. This seems to accede to their positioning as actives, prostitutes, skin suits for hire. The show might ask whether it's possible to create an unacculturated body, but it doesn't really can't answer this question. Even if the answer is yes, and we believe that Victor and Sierra can fall in love and that love persists when they become Priya and Anthony, they still have to live in the world. When they're Priya and Tony in the post-apocalyptic world of Epitaphs 1 and 2, the relationship is much more real and much more problematic than it ever can be as Victor and Sierra. Is this because while Tony and Priya have choices to make, Victor and Sierra don't? Lots of the Whedon shows tackled fate, predestination and prophecy, from Buffy as the Chosen One to Angel and Destiny, Firefly and Mind Control. And Dr. Horrible's Sing-Along Bob takes this to an extreme when Billy decides to become supervillain Dr. Horrible rather than win his heterosexual happy ending with Penny. In Dollhouse, free will is voluntarily given up by people who sign up to be dolls. While Echo and other dolls eventually escape the dollhouse, at least partially, and start making decisions about how to resist their slavery, this action in the political sphere is not necessarily paralleled in the private sphere. If Victor and Sarah are soulmates to the point that Tony and Priya fall in love, does this suggest that they're still programmed still acting on a deeper instinct that precludes conscious choice. Is this what love is? It's as if, Victor as Roger says to Ruddell, it's as if I met this woman in a previous life, as though our love transcends our very being. And another commentator outside the show, it was as if their souls had fallen in love with each other in the absence of the complications of their personalities, and that love continued to grow after their personalities returned. And here's another lovely fan art. Kindred souls. Part of me wants to say that this talk of soulmates is nonsense. It just describes a feeling that may or may not be an idealisation of accumulated factors that make two people fall in love. Another part of me wants to believe this. Do Victor and Sierra give us hope that true love exists? What does that say about how we understand love and how invested we are in the myth of heterosexual romance? We want to accept their love at face value. There are pressing narrative reasons to give characters a happy ending to alleviate the gloom. It's easy watching Dollhouse, to see the corporate big bag, to fight the power, to debate actuals versus actives, to condemn the objectification of the dolls. It's less easy, it's more background. To fight our own programmed desire to see true love triumph, to challenge the myths of heterosexual romance, including this notion of soulmates. Not everyone wants to be challenged in that way, I'm not sure I do. This is what science fiction is for. This estrangement and defamiliarization strategies of science fiction are tools to enable us to see our own society and our own social programming afresh. When Whedon says Dollhouse is about societal brainwashing, this doesn't just apply to corporate control, it applies to heteronormativity in the myths of heterosexual romance. It applies to Victor and Sierra as much as to Echo and Paul.
Thank you, Lorna. The eye rolling was spot on and now recorded on video.
Oh
no! Okay, moving right along. I'm really pleased to invite Dr. Michael Starr from Northampton University to the stage. Michael, we have Michael. It writes extensive about science fiction, Alan Moore, H.G. Wells, and Deleuze. Again, a shameless plug, flyers. Mike, Lorna, and I are co-organizing a conference on TV vampires called Papers on the Table, if anyone's interested. So today, Michael is going to be speaking to us about Whedon's great glass elevator, space and intertextuality in The Cabin in the Woods.
Right. Up. That's all you get. Right, so this is very much a sort of work in progress. It's a collection of sort of very broad, hopefully related thoughts on Whedon and Goddard's Cabin in the Woods, and this basically stems from a very rash claim that I first saw Cabin in the Woods when I came out. I had this sort of epiphany moment. This is all about elevators. Obviously I said lifts, but elevators sounds better in context. So it's all about elevators. I became kind of obsessed with this. So I started seeing elevators in the Whedonverse absolutely everywhere. You know, you've got Angel's elevator to hell. You have Buffy's elevators and initiatives. So it's really, there's some magnum opus to be written about elevators. Is this film, is Cabin in the Woods a hate letter to horror? Is it a sonnet to the genre's best examples, as Whedon said? No, elevators. Right, so being asked here gave me sort of impetus to try to start exploring these examples, particularly in terms of Cabin in the Woods. So we have a collection of thoughts here. It just struck me there's something really interesting going on here in terms of spatial representations, the horror of the film itself, and Whedon's signature intertextuality, as David Lavery has termed it. So I'm going to explore this via various spatial conceits that this elevator sort of presents us with from a variety of conceptual positions, romping very rapidly through some ideas to no great conclusion, but we'll see what we do. So this particular sequence, as illustrated by my awful screen grabs here, that I wish to kind of emphasise, you have this sequence towards the end of the film, 2/3 of the way through. Martin and Dana, the Fool and the Virgin, the last survivors of the horror film, and they discover this elevator via an open grave down from the cabin scenario to the lower levels of the facility, the controlling facility. This is Charlie's great glass elevator of death, as described in the shooting script. And they move down, they move across, and they're confronted by these boxes, other elevators containing all these beasties, which are essentially derived from the pantheon of the horror film. Dana sees one with a puzzle box. She realises that the items that they saw in the cabin earlier have determined their fate. They made us choose, she says. She comes to this realisation. They come to the realisation as the machinations behind their situation. We, the audience, sort of come to realise the standard horror conventions that the film is establishing adhering to. So anyway, the importance here in terms of space, initially at first, is the idea that this elevator is a space between spaces. It's a place of transition, it's a liminal space. And this is an idea, obviously, that's been developed in various ways by a very diverse range of theorists. In sort of basic anthropological terms, such spaces are integral to the processes of ritual and transformation, a painful passage between alternate states. So we have Martin and Dana, they pass from the cabin scenario to the facility, i.e. the sort of diegetic space of the film itself, to the creative processes behind it, effectively. They're going through this transformative process. As Victor Turner puts it in the ritual process, in such liminal spaces, one sense of identity dissolves, bringing about disorientation, but the possibility of new perspectives. So they kind of personify these processes. They've had their personalities rewritten into the horror archetypes necessary for the film ritual, in which they're unwitting participants. We are not who we are, says Martin. So we have this kind of liminal elevator idea. So we can expand on this in spatial terms again. In broader terms, some scholars have equated Turner's conception of liminal spaces to that of Foucault, his notion of heterotopic space. That is to say, transformative spaces subject to ritual that are neither here nor there, and he describes such spaces as, and I'm paraphrasing rapidly here, a space that has layers of meaning or relationships to a large number of fragmentary possible worlds that are juxtaposed or superimposed upon each other and contain undesirable bodies. So in the space of the film, we see these kind of literal fragmentary worlds in these many horror archetypes that the film explicitly alludes to. Monsters in these various elevators, each essentially containing the element of a different horror film universe, and I'll get onto that in a minute. Foucault states that this creates a space of illusion that exposes every real space, i.e. it makes visible what entrants are unwilling or unable to see in their own world, and this works kind of literally for Martin and Dana. And in a wider sense, we, the audience, the very machinery of the horror film is kind of exposed to them and to us. Heatherkin states that heterotopic sites are like laboratories in which new ways of experimenting with ordered society are tried out. And we see this in the scenario controllers, Whitford and Jenkins. They manipulate the cabin scenario as it progresses. They reveal this constructed nature, and this is, of course, mirrors, in wider terms, the kind of non-diegetic world. In other words, the experiments that Whedon and Goddard are performing upon the horror genre by splicing together these imaginary worlds. So, we have these ideas of space as liminal, space as fragmentary, it contains undesirable bodies. We combine these with more specific effect via It's a horror film, so it's kind of obligatory to chuck in Julie Kristeva. Firstly, the concept of the abject. The abject is where the place where meaning collapses, as Barbara Creed puts it, i.e. the liminal space is a space of horror. It dissolves the borders between the subject and the object, the inside and the outside. Marty and Donna enter this elevator through an open grave, past the eviscerated body of the guy that Marty states he had to dismember with a trowel. They're horrified by the monsters they encounter. By this elevator they've crossed Kristeva's symbolic boundary into the realm of death, mutilation and horror, outside of the symbolic order, essentially. So they come across these various monsters, and how we combine this is the idea that these are all sort of inherently, they're kind of intertexts, essentially. Intertext and liminal space relate. They both project a surplus of meaning beyond the thresholds of signification. So we have this kind of plethora of archetypes, essentially, that allude to the pantheon of horror. They provide a point of reference for literally pretty much any supernaturally based horror film ever made. And you have many that are kind of explicitly foregrounded on the whole sort of whiteboard sequence there. The facility staff wager on the outcome of the cabin scenario. Just to cite a few, you have the Hell Lords here, or Formicus, Lord of Bondage and Pain, as they name him, who, he's effectively a Cenobite from Hellraiser. You have the angry molesting tree from The Evil Dead, and of course Pennywise from It there, twins from The Shining. So there are all these sort of explicit references, as well as more general horror archetypes. You have zombies, vampires, sexy witches. And of course there's the old Whedonverse reference, many Whedonverse references, but in terms of the monster, there's a Reaver running around in all of this as well. So what's interesting about this is that the very kind of pleasure of these intertextual references seems to lie in their physical form as monsters, their very sort of viscerality. You only have to look at numerous websites and wikis or whatever that are dedicated kind of monster spotting within this film to see the appeal of these kind of spatially located, I don't know, corporeally embodied intertext, if you like. So if we go back to this, so we have all these kind of intertextual things going on here. So we can apply this back to Kristeva and her conception of intertextuality that she finds in Desire and Language. She says, well, this functions on two axes. You have horizontal axes, vertical axes of intertexts. If you want, without going into too much detail, we could read the cabin's elevator. It has very clearly defined vertical and horizontal movements, revealing these intertextual monsters. It's maybe a visual representation of these axes. What's more, she posits that the text is constructed as a mosaic of citations as the intertextual elements absorb and transform themselves and the other texts. And this sequence here just, it's very mosaic-like. It strikes me as this very nice representation of this. So, just to attempt to tie this up, and where does this lead us? Well, like I said, this is a work in progress, but we can attempt to unify possibly these spatial intertextual issues via the subsequent carnage sequence. So initially, all these sort of beasties are all nicely contained, nicely ordered, but they are released, they escape. After they escape, carnage ensues on an epic scale. So in spatial terms, we can relate this to Turner's statement that dissolution of order during liminality can lead to the dissolution of all stable frameworks. Kristeva poetically states in Desire and Language that when texts are examined in terms of intertextuality and we are witness to their capacity to inform, absorb and transform each other, they themselves become monstrous hybrids that resist containment. Intertextuality makes a text a living hell on earth. And this is quite literal in this case. They all run amok, they rip each other apart, along with those attempting to sort of contain them, which leads to the climax of the hand. Climax of the film, with the big giant hand, in which we are witness to the destruction of well, everything, really. The director's audience, the literal death of the author, that's one way of looking at it. So, you know, to bastardize Umberto Eco, I suppose, at the end, this isn't one movie, it's movies, it uses all these formulas, it results in this intensively intertextual film that carries an intensification of the effect of the genre in general. Well, does it do more than this? Well, yes and no. I mean, in the terms I've discussed, I suppose you can read this act of kind of textual destruction in a constructive way, in characterising intertextuality in the context of liminal space with potential for change. We create conditions for the potential production of a new order, a new discourse. You know, it's time for change, says Marty at the very end of the film, at the denouement. Quite how or if the Cabin in the Woods will contribute to any sort of construction of a new order in this sense, whether it will be reconstituted or whether it does have any kind of transformative effects upon, say, the horror pantheon to come, as we sort of clearly hopes, or we assume by this. Well, that remains to be seen.
Thank you. We move on to our final speaker of the evening, Dr. Matt Sangster from Royal Holloway, who has recently completed his PhD thesis, living as an author in the Romantic period, I'm not going to get that recognition of self-fashioning, you can leave the handout, and is speaking to us tonight on Whedon, Writing, Whedon.
I have no PowerPoint, so I will sit.
Shall I take one down?
It is perhaps slightly
Don't want that looming over you.
So Sarah didn't have 20 minutes here. Materials advertising this event described Joss Whedon as an increasingly ubiquitous fanboy auteur. An interesting paper could perhaps be constructed considering the first two words of this statement. Certainly Whedon is currently particularly visible due to the gargantuan success of Avengers Assemble, his part in the critically acclaimed Cabin in the Woods and press interest in his forthcoming Much Ado About Nothing. However, his triumphant 2012 comes after a period during which his profile was relatively low. It might be argued that 3 films in a year, impressive as this is, represents less of a quantitative media presence than the point in 2002, when he had 3 weekly series running concurrently. Such a paper might construct parameters for measuring ubiquity and consider the arc of Whedon's career in this context. We might also call into question the extent to which ubiquity is really desirable for a filmmaker or artist, thinking about how it can act as a considerable restraint on audiences' expectations and willingness to invest in particular works, and considering the ways that Whedon's diverse productions and enduring popularity with cult audiences left him relatively well placed for avoiding such traps. In this short paper, though, I'm more interested in the second pair of words in Dylan Venetia's description, fanboy auteur. These words strike me both as an extremely good definition of Whedon, as a notion in some ways intrinsically paradoxical, merging traditional consumer and producer and mass culture at high. Wondering if they've been connected in this way before, I consulted the internet, and the Google search for fanboy auteur results 9 in 10 refer to this event, at least on my personalised Google, now that Google is no longer universal. 1 to 8 all relate in various ways to work on fan culture by Suzanne Scott. Scott writes in a piece entitled Rethinking the Audience-Producer Relationship that the fanboy auteur differs from his pre-convergence predecessors through his narrativized fan credentials and self-identification as a fan/geek, positioning himself as an ideal, if ultimately conflicted, intermediary between producer, text, and audience. Scott's fanboy auteur is a rather anxious figure, concerned both with establishing his legitimacy in relation to previous valued works and with exerting control over his own creations. He is also a figure who seems, in this description at least, intrinsically lonely and lacking in self-awareness. While there are certainly genre writers whose public personas express these kinds of awkwardness, Whedon is not really one of them. Scott's description also raises a wider question about whether attempting to take on both roles, fan and auteur, is an act done necessarily in bad faith, which I'll touch on later in this paper. From a fairly early stage, Whedon was identified as an auteur creator, and this definition has been placed prominently in reference works. For example, in the section on dialogue on Wikipedia's Joss Whedon page, the 21st century's default first port of call notes that, according to one of Buffy writers, it's just the way Joss actually talks. Or at least it did until I checked the quotation, found out while the sentence was right, virtually none of the words were, and corrected it to a lot of it is the way Joss naturally speaks. It's interesting that this statement is attributed to an unnamed and therefore unpersoned writer. In reality, the speaker was Jane Espenson, as I footnoted. However, this shift in focus away from the writing team and onto their leader largely reflects the tone of the featurette from which the quotation is taken. Espenson continues that Joss's way of speaking was absorbed by all of us and put into the speeches. David Fury similarly opines that Joss really talks that way and we all kind of adopted it. For Buffy then, even at least in the accounts of his writers, was ostensibly the authenticating voice, the specificities of the series springing primarily from him. One way of reading these descriptions would be to see them as slightly creepy. The writers could be seen as submitting to possession by Whedon's ways of using language. Another, though, would be to highlight the fanish and collaborative aspects of this inspiration, seeing the process of creating Buffy as a process of mutually exploring and enjoying the possibilities of language. Later in the feature, Martin Oxon describes the show's dialogue as a kind of word game that the writers have. Whedon is certainly credited as the game's inventor, but the writers obviously revel in playing it to enrich the series, as is made clear in the examples they give of lines which they've written, which they're particularly proud. Even while promoting Whedon as auteur, then, the feature expresses that Buffy's speak is not a creation whose copyright he jealously enforces, but rather something closer to a commons, a unifying mode through which a community can work collaboratively. At this point, it might seem as if I'm blatantly cheating by talking about Buffy in a session specifically designed for the discussion of things that come after it. But the implication that Buffy is somehow finished is an awkward one in the context of the development of Whedon's reputation. As of today, the entire Buffy series can be ordered from Amazon for only $35.95 with free delivery, and streamed online through a number of legitimate and less legitimate services. Clips and remixes are circulated constantly, the episodes continue to be reviewed, discussed and recalled, criticism continues to be written, and those who are involved continue to be questioned about the show and often defined by their association with it. In some senses, then, it's impossible to consider Whedon after Buffy without acknowledging the extent to which it still defines the ways that people see his work and refract his personality. Another problem with considering Whedon after Buffy is that Buffy continues in comic form, albeit not without controversy resulting from its divergence from the norms of the original series. Whedon admitted as much in the statement with which he wrapped up Season 8, in which he stated that Season 9 will return to the everyday trials that made Buffy more than a superhero. He continues, I was so excited to finally have an unlimited budget that I wanted to make of the book an epic that realised along the way that the things I love best were the things you love the best, the peeps. He adds later that we're not going back to square one, but our square will definitely have a one-ishness to it, a statement that self-reinforces with its Buffy-ish voice. While we by no means disavow Season 8 entirely, in stating how Season 9 will differ, he explicitly aligns himself with what he identifies as the fans' desires. This could be seen as a cynical marketing ploy, an attempt to relaunch the franchise. However, the statement could also be read as recognising that Buffy is to a large extent a community creation and possession. This is stressed in Whedon's personal pronouns. His eyes tend to adhere to moments of self-deprecation, his we's to the accomplishments of a collective creative team he thanks profusely, including, this has been a long, strange trip, but it worked, brackets, when it did, because so many overqualified souls poured themselves into it. While he isn't disclaimed his being Buffy's auteur, he's by no means wedded to this meaning. He's the sole factor that determines the comic's meaning or its value. Concludes the article by asking rhetorically, so why am I so giddy about Season 9? Answering, maybe I'm a fan. Rather than asserting his control over Buffy, then, Whedon places himself among its readership. While he is writing here, in Scott's words, as an intermediary between producer, text, and audience, his mediation does not seek to assert the preeminence of his interpretation so much as to recognise the input of others, both the collaborators who help shape the work and the fans who act as its conscience, as well as its consumers. Of course, from this passage alone, it's difficult to tell whether Whedon is putting words into his fans' mouths, placing himself in service of a construct of fandom that he himself creates. However, when he writes himself elsewhere, he also recognises the limits of his own authority. He posts, albeit relatively frequently, on whedonesc.com, a community weblog about his work. Rather than asserting his credentials, which would perhaps be surplus requirements considering the venue, his profile there is a piece of careful frivolity. A svelte and mysterious jewel thief, Joss Whedon has appeared as Batman's nemesis in several embarrassing fantasies. He also goes by the names El Hombre, the Shadow Guy, and Hoppy Hoppy Bunny. He likes long walks on the beach if they're brief and nowhere near water. He prefers blondes, brunettes, redheads, bald people, or people with big hats, so you're not even sure. Turn-offs, insensitive men, people who smoke and then burst suddenly and horribly into flames. He is often very dizzy. This is a funny piece of writing, but also in many ways a generic one. Interestingly, Googling finds quite a few people who've nicked it wholesale and pasted it as their own profiles. Except for the quality of the writing, then, this profile does not claim any kind of special status. The tone is the one his most common employ, defiantly whimsical, providing a particular fallible voice, rather than seeking to provide any kind of authoritative interpretation. In the most explicit example, responding to an article questioning his feminist credentials, he writes, I wasn't going to touch the whole feminism debate, but I'm wacky sometimes. All I'll say is this, what I have to say about myself and my intention should have nothing to do with your experiences of work. Continues a little later, I've tried to hide from my work, and even blogging on feminist issues feels like a dangerous trap for me, because once I take a stand as a public figure, the purity of the watching is gone. debate about me rage on. I don't care what you think as long as it's about me. Yes, I just quoted Fall Out Boy, but that debate should really ignore what I say in these my morning cup of tea posts. While recognising his words carry a particular interest for his fans, something abundantly clear from the rigour with which Whedon collects materials relating to him, he disclaims his ability to speak ex cathedra. His conclusion to season 8 places himself in a parish position in relation to his own works, able to provide commentary and express enthusiasm without claiming a conflicted position of privilege. Includes the post on feminism by writing that those reading should judge my work on its own merits unless it has none, in which case give me a pass because I said I was a feminist. The joke serving to reinforce it. When Whedon writes Whedon, then I contend that he's generally quite careful not to present himself as an infallible authority figure. Instead, he uses a particular and personal voice which stresses the limits of his perspective and admits his potential for failure. In the Buffy season 8 valedictory, the promise he makes is that the ride won't get smoother. He also heaps praise on his collaborators, perhaps seeking to counterbalance to some extent the weight to which his opinions are given in reading his works, making sure that their contributions are recognised by professing his admiration. For him, then, perhaps fanishness serves as a way of talk about his work without asserting the deadening and divisive authority of the auteur. This is also the position, and this is the final bit, implied in his characterisation and commentary of the musical, which he describes on Whedon-esque as the most painstaking, exhausting piece of whimsy I've ever mistaken for a good idea. In the commentary, the cast and actors of Dr. Holloway sing parodic versions of themselves over the original musical, supposedly providing commentary, but in fact more frequently zooming off on tangents or getting caught up in arguments. Whedon's character plays off the stereotype of the tortured auteur and is given short shrift by the rest of the cast. For example, when he states that the idea for the musical came from pain, the others resolve not to talk to him further because he's sad and confusing. His song, Heartbroken, appears relatively late in the proceedings and bemoans the tendency for people to pick apart the things they watch, the process breaking the illusions which attracted them in the first place. The rest of the cast berate him, arguing that they have to sell some DVDs, and that without the interest created by the interpreter operators now released alongside his works, Whedon would find his fame and fan base gone and be ignored at Comic-Con. Nevertheless, I'm inclined to think that while Whedon recognises that these criticisms are to some extent true, the protest the song makes about process and promotion taking precedence over the works themselves is to some extent genuine. After all, commentary itself neatly sidesteps providing a more traditional commentary on Dr. Horrible, replacing explanation and its implicit authority claims with the interplay of a narrativized community. If fanishness is necessarily the activity of a group, and the auteur a solitary role, Whedon seems to me to be fairly clearly on the side of collaboration and debate, rather than hierarchies of legitimacy.
Thank you very much. That worked really well, and we now have plenty of time for discussion and questions. So I wonder if you want to ask our speakers to come up to the table so they can face everyone. There's space, and there's just enough chairs.
Connie, is there a way to kill the projector? To avoid someone being whitened?
Yeah, I'm just going to wind it. Okay.
I procure some water.
Yes. Give us a moment to collect water. Okay, I just want to say thanks to all of our presenters who delivered not only my really interesting individual papers, really interesting, but also, given this event was thinking after Buffy, I think it just raises a whole range of different, quite fascinating questions about what we mean when thinking about Whedon after Buffy. And I think what struck me, my whole moment to say, is the different ways in which we can think about Whedon, both as Whedon, the man, commentator, critique, Whedon, the kind of leading person within media industry, kind of affecting the face of media, and then also Whedon, the creator of these kind of very interesting texts across different media. So I think there's a lot to think about. So I want the chance really to open up to questions. So if anyone has any questions or comments they'd like to make, or I can get the ball rolling. I'll give you a chance to think. I suppose my question to everyone, is kind of coming from the last one, is this event is after Buffy, and Joss Whedon after Buffy. I mean, can we think of Joss Whedon after Buffy, or does everything we look at with Whedon start looking through the prism of Buffy? I mean, I was struck by that point about, what does that mean after Buffy? Do we kind of think about him? Can we think about him? Has Buffy had such a long-lasting impact that everything we look at is kind of through that prism? Is there a connection to what he's done, or is he moving further and further away from Buffy? Anyone jump in?
It partly depends on who you are. I think there's a bunch of scholars interested in Whedon generally. I think that's entirely right. It's impossible to kind of think after Buffy, because Buffy's ongoing in the generative kind of text that most of things fall from. I have had the great pleasure to teach various Whedon texts over the course of my career, and in the last couple of years, a significant proportion of students haven't ever heard of Buffy. So their engagement with Whedon, if they haven't engaged with it at all, is either because I've made them watch something, or because they've come across Cabin in the Woods or something else. So I think there are ways in which the reception of Whedon really shifts depending on who you are and where you're from. As scholars, I think it's difficult to avoid Buffy, but I think the question is more multi-faceted than that.
I completely agree. I think it's probably a context thing. It really depresses me now when students haven't heard about it. But I think interestingly, I guess it's a generational thing. But it just seems to me that whatever he does, it gets compared to Buffy. Perhaps not with new or younger viewers, but yes, scholars definitely. And perhaps in the industry as well. I'm not so sure about that side of it, but it's definitely it's cast a long shadow. I think whether that's the right way to phrase it, but it seems to be present.
Do you think that means that we need to take? Not that I think everyone should see Buffy, or students should be forced to sit down and watch it, all of it, all of it. But does it mean maybe we as scholars should be taking a page of their book by looking at Whedon from a different perspective and looking at it not necessarily from the point of view of Buffy, but saying, let's look at Much Ado as independent filmmaker and not the creator of Buffy, or maybe to sit there like some people kind of looking at his bookshelves for his books on memoir texts in his living room in Much Ado. I mean, should we be thinking about him as a different kind of filmmaker now?
Just briefly, I find it interesting how, I can only speak for myself personally, but thinking of him as some sort of, he's the great underdog who's never been truly appreciated kind of thing. Oh, everything gets cancelled and blah, blah, blah. And I can still think of him through this lens, but of course he's now enormous. He's one of the big, Hollywood filmmakers, and therefore does one need to reconceptualise one's take on this? Obviously I do, because I was delighted going with the underdog in so.
I guess the Avengers is a particular sort of challenge in some ways, both because it has its own enormous sort of back tradition in a similar way to sort of, but not necessarily one that Buffy scholars are familiar. The other thing is just so much advanced. I made an argument about sort of 2002 where he has so many other things going on, but the Avengers is just so incredibly enormous. I think it's now up to the third biggest grossing movie of all time. It might sort of overtake Titanic potentially in the unadjusted ratings. But it's also, I guess, more of an awkward movie for talking about Joss Whedon, because while it's very Whedon-y, it has that sort of galaxy of films around it directed by other people on which it's contingent to a large extent. So it's more. I think we do like Whedon as auteur, as a figure for us to think about things through, and I think it's more difficult in the case of the Avengers. Avengers is something.
Funny thing is with the auteur thing, thinking about Whedon and all of his body of work, is that we don't tend to do that very often, because it's a bit out of favour, isn't it? The kind of concept, isn't it, in film theory, certainly, but we don't seem to have. It's fine with Whedon.
It's kind of implicit, isn't it?
It's strange, which is why I really enjoyed Matthew Pateman sort of putting that together with the Fanboy thing, newer concept. It kind of works. But I've always find that interesting about Whedon, that we think about him that way, and it doesn't seem to be a problem.
And should it be a problem?
I don't know. I'm not saying it should.
Yeah. Well, I think it's an interesting point, because I think it is, you're right, and it's kind of, I think it is, I mean, you, Matt, mentioned the way in which he's constantly trying to highlight the skills of all the people he's working with and the contributions, and it's one of those things that we kind of lump, there's kind of Whedon the man, but then we sort of lump everything else into that, and he kind of like pulls it out to say, but there are all these other people, and there are other voices. So it's a complicated one. Any questions?
I just didn't take blame for using the first Fanboy without really thinking that one through.
Yeah.
Maybe he's
You gave me a look for my paper. I don't know, it's been crashing out. It's actually giving
but maybe think of him then as a Fanboy scripter. Is that a better way to put it?
I mean, clearly the writing is hugely important, but I think because of writing too much. I mean, one of the problems with analysis of Whedon's work generally is that it's so logo-centric for something which is so visual. And whilst the writing is stunning, I think we do need to maintain the idea, whether auteurs are right, I'm not sure, we need to maintain and prioritise the idea that he was a filmmaker or a television maker as much as simply as a writer. So I think our first Fanboy also, I really like what you do with that notion of the complications surrounding it, but at least, going back to my point, the idea that we do allow Whedon this extraordinary latitude. I mean, this idea that he's somehow this poor underdog. I mean, David Lavery, a few years ago, did a fantastic comparison of the stuff that he's worked on as a script document writer versus the infamous Mr. Bay, and they're pretty much equal one another in terms of gross products in the cinema. I mean, Whedon has never been an underdog. He's had a 7-season show, a 5-season show, a 2-season show, and a half-season show, a heap of blockbusters. This guy is not an underdog. He positions himself brilliantly as an underdog, but he is not an underdog.
But that's part of the construction of the Fanboy. The Fanboy is always going to be the underdog, in some sense. Yeah.
He is, yes, but I think it's a problem.
No, yeah, it is a problem.
Yeah. But no, I think that's right, because it is that sense that he's a success. Everything's, even Firefly, yes, I mean, because Firefly is where the underdog myth kind of really gestates. It's this great show that we all love that gets cancelled.
Yeah.
And it's the one of the, he got a feature film made from it. You know, so again, it's even that one, which is the centerpiece, is the one that sort of shows that he is, going back to your point, Matthew, which was, he is this incredibly astute figure within the media industries who knows how to. So he may keep going back to Fox, and we all sometimes question those decisions that working with Fox. But at the same time, he knows how to manipulate the system in a way which I think you raised some really interesting points about the fact that will the legacy be the way in which he keeps rethinking the system and kind of working the system.
But that kind of commercial and industry discourse is usually kind of played down in all this, especially if he's privileging Fanboy as his prime identity, then you're not going to talk about that stuff. And you know, most of these kind of DVD extras and interviews and all that kind of ancillary text that surround this usually focus on creation rather than on industry and commercialism and monetization, because nobody wants to hear you. Do we want to hear Joss Whedon talking about monetization?
Well, I do.
Can you make that as good as Romney's on it?
Well, yes, you can. Dr. Horrible was the proof that he monetizes well.
But you know, I've just written a paper for the Buffy fan phenomena, probably about the influence of Buffy on dark romance, and I've kind of pinned that around the answer to a question which was, what are you most proud of? And of course this is probably dated in about 2007, and he said, you know, my little show that changed the world, being Buffy. You think in another 10 years is he going to say something different in response to that question? But he's never really going to say monetizing the internet.
That's true, and I do think as a creative individual he's going to be much more concerned about the texts he produces, but I think as scholars it's interesting to think about how those texts get created and how they get distributed and the structures that allow them to be.
Yeah.
Because the greatest myth of all is to assume that somehow a creative genius can just do what he does, especially in the television context. You have to have money and lots of it.
And I think, I don't know whether anybody else, I think we all teach some of this reading stuff, and I think actually the thing that we get the most reception from, I don't know whether you agree with this, Mike, is teaching Dr. Horrible as an example of kind of, you know, TV3 and internet television and television that's not television. And I think that gets the most interested reception because it's still one of the few really successful and effective examples of those kinds of things. Whereas Buffy's just, you know, a dated TV text with a kick-ass action hero. Well, so what?
Yeah, I have a question for Matthew. I'm just interested in that conversation about the monetization and the creation that Lorna sort of asked. So, is there something about the industries that he creates, is that sort of a part of the creation? Because I was trying to think about what you're saying in relationship to sort of something like visual art and the ways in which so the role of the curator kind of change in the exhibition space, so the ways in which those kinds of industries may contribute to the product that's created. So is there something about the fact that he can play within an industry that's itself sort of part of his creative genius, right? So rather than downplaying that as just industry, it is creation.
I think that, yeah, absolutely. I think that his role within the industry allows him to have creative freedom and a playfulness within that, which does mean that I would like to look at that as part of his creative capacity. What is he able to do to reform what the structures of the studio system or the network system kind of might typically imply. And that's partly because I genuinely love thinking of television and film as mass media to public art. But I think that if it is mass media to public art, then whilst focusing on the art is clearly hugely important, we also need to think about the mass mediated part of that and how that comes to be. And if we think about the totality of what Whedon does as a great exemplary moment of mass mediated public art, from co-writing Speed up to doing Much Ado, and I don't think we can think of his work as a single look, but if that kind of totality of context fits together, then I think that is itself the question you're right about creative capacity. His own creative capacity within the industry is itself a kind of creativity, I would say.
Yeah, I'm trying to formulate this. I'm trying to think about post-Buffyism. And it strikes me that both Dollhouse and Cabin in the Woods present very poignant, volatile metaphors for Hollywood production. I mean, one is a satanic ritual to propitiate the ancient gods, right? And the other is, form of prostitution and total manipulation, corporate invasion. And I wonder if what that might have to do with post-Buffyism and Whedon's success, that turn, because I don't really see that in. There's a lot of intertextuality in Buffy, but there's not that kind of very pointed, self-reflexive, satirical thrust. And I wonder if you see, or what you think about seeing those as post-Buffy commentaries.
But you do start to get them in Angel. That's probably one of the first places we become, especially in the last season of Angel. And everybody always says after they knew they were cancelled. Where Wilfred and Hart are just the network. But I think that's also where you start to get that kind of contradiction between, kind of fight the corporate power, but going by our DVDs and t-shirts. And that's all kind of an interesting tension between, kind of celebrating the genius of Whedon and all of these kind of products. Don't know what anybody else.
Well, I think it's interesting, in Buffy you don't have typically that corporation figure. You've got the Watchers Council to an extent, but you haven't really anything quite that. And you've got the initiative to an extent, but nothing quite as dramatically clearly corporate as you get with Wilfred and Hart, as you get with in the Dollhouse, you've got to do the way in which that's where it's structured. So in a sense, I suppose you could say that one of the reasons why Buffy, you could make an argument, I'm not sure I believe it, but one of the reasons why Buffy has the power it has is a certain kind of naivety, a certain kind of innocence. Although you have all these huge growing up issues, you don't really confront the real horror of being a grown up, which is bureaucracy. Routine. Yeah. The banal, cloying, failing repetition of being an institution that cannot do anything. I'll withdraw that.
Well, I was thinking it's interesting because the closest you get, and it's not the same, but it's season 6 is the Buffy faces real life. And it's where, and of course that's a season that lots of people struggled with. And there was a lot of dissatisfaction with Buffy because at that point, because of that, this isn't what it's about, and yet it was attempting to begin to show. So we have the Double Mean Palace, you know, as that getting glimpses, but it doesn't quite, I don't think he's quite ready to, or it's not coming across, whether it's him or them or her. Any other thoughts on that?
It just reminds me of a particularly good review of Cabin that I came across. It's wonderfully damning. So I made a note of this. This was some comment what this was from, but obsessed by their own creative dilemmas, the filmmakers simply lament an inability to speak anything new by making a film that simply reiterates that. They're like a young film student who has just discovered Christavia or Baudrillard, preoccupied with notions of simulacrum, cinema's ritual and the abject. These are constant conscience iterations rather than meaningful organic applications. The Cabin in the Woods plays like an essay film. It considers the artist far more than it does genre or diegesis. And I really like that. You know, is that what's being, you know, but is that a bad thing? Is the question. I say no. But you know, and with something like Cabin, I mean, it really did divide opinions. I mean, I think it was, well, Sage this year, I saw at least there was one paper speaking, I think it was Chris Woodford was saying, this is an act of genre snobbery. It was very, very damning. And then there was another one on kind of online research into this, sort of saying, Whedon fans loved it. It was the reaction had been very, very sort of positive so far. So, you know, is it a sign of having nothing to say?
It does seem to come back to him again, doesn't it? You know, those kind of views, because it's this sort of, if you're familiar with Whedon, then you understand that it's a kind of love affair with, you know, like Tarantino had or something. But if not, you might perhaps misread it and see it as kind of just reworking lots of old film. But I don't know, it does seem to come back to him yet again.
Yeah. And that's, I mean, it's another problematic text because those kinds of discussions completely elude Goddard. You know, who becomes the invisible presence there. And suddenly it becomes all about Whedon in a way that almost never, and it's another interesting example of Whedon being quite different, because when in Hollywood is the screenwriter given that level of authority and authorship over a film text? Almost never, except Whedon. And Goddard becomes just, you know, like the technician, put the shots together.
So I think that with Sorkin as well, there's another person who has a very distinctive dialogue style.
That's true.
But I think probably to a lesser extent.
To a lesser extent. I mean, but I agree with you. I think that's something interesting that Sorkin does have that. And I was thinking with Social Network, that it was, when that came out, it was very much discussed, though Fincher was given a lot of credit for lending a visual style to that script, you know, and kind of creating that, so still recognized for what he brought to it. Any other questions? Thoughts on the hand?
I was just thinking about, in terms of after Buffy and sort of Buffy as a finishing point, but also its lack of conclusion. And I was just wondering, for anybody, what you think of the absence of conclusions in sort of the mythos and the legacy of Joss Whedon. Things like obviously the cancelled texts that are part of his myth. That kind of ongoing idea that Buffy got bad when Whedon wandered off because he got bored. Avengers, obviously his work with Marvel, he's in a big sandbox that's constantly open to reboot. What you do, you're doing Shakespeare, that's always versioning. And just sort of thinking about Matt's ideas there of his own failure to be conclusive in his own readings of his text. I just wonder, is there something essential in something essentially inconclusive in Whedon that is part of his authorship? I don't know if that's anything.
Well, Buffy is brilliant because Buffy is bounded by questions. Are you sure this is a good idea? What to do now? The first and last line of the television Buffy. I think that, in a sense, if your question is right, I think it's a really interesting way of thinking about it. Then I'm not just essentially inclusive about Whedon, but I think that Whedon revels in the questioning rather than the answering, which is one of the reasons I think we're so scholarly attractive. I'm not sure what to put it means commercially, but I think the scholarly is quite nice about that.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point. And I don't know to what extent it's him and his whole team, blah, blah, blah. And also the sort of the nature of television that tends to be long running and open-ended, and yes, sometimes I don't know when they're going to get cancelled, etc. So, but yes, I think there is definitely that seems apparent in lots of his works. Nothing's final.
Sorry.
I think that's sort of interesting in relation to other sort of people with large fan bases who are less good at negotiating them and so on. So when you decide they're going to negotiate things differently, like sort of the sort of fury when Rowling tries to close down things at the end of Harry Potter. He's very good at not doing those sorts of things, or not sort of going on vast rants on Amazon like Anne Rice or things like that. I think one thing like possibly you didn't really get into the paper is how long-lasting those, and how quickly things like that, where an author says something like that, would go over vast sort of expanses of the internet, how long they last. So something that sort of 20 years ago someone might have said to a room of people would not really have travelled much beyond that, and people now sort of stored permanently and then added to the Wikipedia entry and become part of the permanent record. I think he's quite. I think I agree that he doesn't like to finish things, but I think that sort of probably ties in a bit to his liking of sort of spaces around things and the idea that things could be restarted, and just sort of his, in some senses, his sensibility is not about sort of finishing something up or closing it down, but about all the cool things that can be done with it. And all the cool things are done, you'd rather just leave it hanging in case there's a chance to go back to some extent, or at least that's the impression you get.
I suppose, yeah, this sort of potentiality is the appeal, isn't it? Oh, if only they hadn't cancelled it. If only they hadn't messed up his script to aim for, think of what could have happened. Yeah.
And there's a fantastic quotation, remember, it's about the end of Angel. He's describing the Angel, he says people complained about the lack of closure. He said, but there's a great amount of open shut.
Isn't that, building on that, isn't that partially a monetisation issue as well? I mean, if you leave the narrative open and you don't close it down, it's like Star Wars, there was supposed to be 9 films, and then there's like, an endless cottage industry. If you close the whole thing down, you close some of those possibilities for revenue, and then you have to go down the path of like the evil twin brother that turns up because you killed the main guy.
Absolutely, yeah. I think there's a huge amount of in a very different context, you can argue that the postmodern move to open narratives is just the kind of the cultural expression of some kind of rabbinical economics, where you kind of have massive pluralizations of markets and stories and massive pluralizations of monetization capacities. And then the question becomes, at what point do you step into critique that, and what point do you say we just have to accept and sort of work with? I've not asked that question, but you're right. I think the openness is potentially very much part of sort of a capitalization of culture, which Whedon is very adept at manipulating.
It's also got a kind of comic book mentality to it as well, there, hasn't it? The endless reversioning of Spider-Man or whatever comic character, and they'll kill them off and bring them back. I think his background is kind of there, which maybe where some of that comes from.
Yeah, so I was thinking with all of this question is that it says so much about where he, the areas, the types of art forms he's drawn to. That he ends up working in TV, which is inherently inclusive. He works in comics. He works in Marvel. Like suddenly, that's going to be where he's going to make his big splash on cinema. But even Cabin Woods is about recycling, and the whole point. You can just see he is drawn to that. And it is that combination of art and commerce that he manages and plays with. And that's kind of, and it's a meaning of his geekdom and his own just interest in this kind of long, drawn-out tales that allow him to just reinvent it non-stop.
We've got the things moving across the different stories as well. We've got all the sort of the Whedon cast, which is famously east. So people turn up in sort of different roles, and which sort of carry echoes of their previous roles, but sometimes they play against their previous types and these sorts of things. So it is. It's a sandbox, just not just within each text, but also sort of across his. I think the idea of the Whedon verse is in fact probably something that works quite well, which would not work so well for other creators, more keen to what's the horrible management term, silo their different. But also, I think in some ways he quite likes the challenge of dealing with the things that they've gone off the rails a bit.
Yeah.
I think that I'm quite happy to accept his excitement about season 9 having that season 8 go over badly as being quite genuine. There are various points where sort of they swerve in one way or another, and then the challenge for him is to move them back, but he doesn't sort of retcon the thing that happened out of it entirely. He sort of, and there's sort of all in the later seasons, there's all these, often the first part of the later seasons of all programs is about dealing from the fallout of the end of the previous season, so it's not each season as a self-contained thing, but they all sort of run together and resolve each other. So there's a sort of, I don't know, part of the things he seems to enjoy doing is writing himself into problems and then writing himself out, or getting other people to help writing out.
And there's of course, as the industry aspect where the openness and the inevitable kind of requirement to kind of move beyond is built simply on the fact that you are working in this very volatile industry where Seth Green will one day say, I want to go and do a film, and Howard Benson will say, I want to go and do X, and suddenly you've got to do something with these characters, and perhaps you have this arc, you've got to stop that arc and rewrite it. And I think that's one of his real creative capacity, is really confronting those industry difficulties and making them into great art. Even if some people respond to that quite negatively, as in the case of what happened after Howard Benson left.
Yeah, I was just talking about the underdog and Fanboy auteur thing. It seems to me that he's quite close to like Kevin Smith as a sort of Fanboy auteur, and where they use the same cast over and over, and also actually about the internet monetization. You know, with Kevin Smith doing Red State, taking it on tour and stuff, and showing new ways to do things. What I was wondering was what you guys thought of his response to, you know, when the studio announced they're going to make a new Buffy film. Because it seemed to me that, you know, he's very self-depreciating, but at the same time he does have this sense of control, because, you know, when it comes to TV it's complicated, but he's the showrunner, you know, so he is sort of like the auteur when it comes to, you know, the TV aspect. I was just wondering what you guys thought of his response to that announcement he made to the Buffy film.
I think he's a jealous god. He doesn't want people playing with his toys, and yeah, it's quite right too. He does do this great job of saying, this is my team and they're wonderful, but he also says time after time after time, this is my show. I am responsible for the show. I am the person that makes the show happen. Every week I do X, Y, and Z. So I think he is incredibly invested, deeply, deeply emotionally and financially invested in his products. And I don't see any actual conflict between that kind of openness to other people's contributions and the very, very clear sort of disquiet, at the very least, he had in the idea that somebody else would take over his Buffy, because it is, after all, his Buffy.
I guess the other thing is that one of the reasons he's able to vanish is that so many other people are making the auteur claim that he doesn't need to make it. Part of the reason he is able to sort of be goofy in lots of these circumstances is because people are already so invested in the idea of him as a person that if he becomes more personable, that plays positively rather than seeming. And sort of another sense. So, but I guess these collaborative networks are also. I mean, he says nice things about them, but they're also saying an awful lot of nice things about him. I can't think of many interviews with angry Joss Whedon alumni. I think that also. It's probably to his credit as someone who's pleasant to work with, but I think that's also a large part of the way that his myth gets built. It's sort of this reciprocal process with the team around him. And so yes, when Buffy is removed, there's an awful lot of other people going to stand up as well. So all he really has to do is do a push, and then I think it's sort of fallen off the agenda again now, hasn't it? So.
I had a question for Lorna, and this may be because I want to see the eye rolling again. I suppose, what I like about your paper is the way in which, it kind of doesn't answer the question, but, because it's raising a question about heterosexual romance and how much we want how much we're torn between a critique of it and a desire for it. And I guess it's, you know, do we see this across, like, do we, you know, there's romance in all of this, you know, across a lot of Whedon's texts. It keeps coming back to this idea, and I'm wondering, you know, how much do you think Dollhouse is kind of unique in kind of foregrounding it in that way, in the kind of way that you've discussed, that kind of both critiques and conforms? Or is this something that that continues to replay in this work?
I need to look at Cabin in the Woods and Avengers for this as well. But certainly I think in television, partly because of the kind of serialised nature of the television that he does, it's always going to be effective because it's partly kind of industry requirement that you have, especially unrequited love and unfulfilled romance. And that's usually where it's gone until about Firefly, where you suddenly had a happily married couple that, you know, everybody says Fox didn't want it, but he insisted that they were there. And I think it does become incredibly foregrounded in Dollhouse by its very nature. But the thing that forced me to write that paper, as if at gunpoint, was listening to lots of people talking about Echo and Paul and Dollhouse and all this, but Victor and Sierra, that's just like happily ever after. And nobody seemed to notice that that was going on. So I think it becomes particularly acute there, perhaps because of the kind of compression of the narrative that you get, especially in season 2, and the way that they become kind of pushed out on its periphery, where kind of Echo takes centre stage, but then it still feeds back into this kind of eternal reflection on what it says and what it means. But I don't know, it was very, you know, I was apprehensive about doing paper before and this time because it's very unacademic and personal. But I think that's partly to me Whedon's creative genius is, and that's probably why it becomes so popular and successful, is that it speaks to us. And it's not here. I suppose it's partly in our pocket, but it's partly that it speaks very deeply to us about things that matter, and that's, you know, what stories are.
So I was struck by thinking, because when you think of so much the other shows, and you think about disrupted romance, like I said, it's a television thing, you can't have Wesley and Fred get together because, you know, the pain in Wesley is him loving Fred and never being able to have her so soon. Of course, she was going to die as soon as she admitted she loved him. That was it. But what struck me was talking and, you know, eagerly awaiting Much Ado. There's something interesting about the kind of going back to what you were saying about this kind of reusing cast, because Much Ado, I think one of my favourite Shakespeare plays, but people who have seen it say how satisfying it is to be able to see Wesley and Fred finally together. And it's kind of an interesting kind of thing where you're kind of getting this, and you're saying it's a dual pleasure. Yes, it's Benedict and Beatrice, and it's Wesley and Fred, in a way that he isn't able to do with the TV, and he's going to kind of defer it. And every other show except, you know, the Sierra Victor, they're disrupted. And yet the film's kind of, there is this kind of, Much Ado is kind of giving us that. And there's but it goes back to the point, there's a desire, but we want them together. You know, so that's saying back to the idea that fundamentally we want to believe that they were not only within their own world, that they were so destined to be together that they transcend the angel verse into the Shakespeare verse. So there's something there. Right? Maybe that's my own perverse, I'm so excited. Any other thoughts, questions?
Can I ask you a question that way? Is Much Ado...
You're supposed to answer me a question.
This is a really interesting phrase. Is Much Ado a Shakespeare-verse film or a Whedon-verse film? Or a both-verse film?
It's a good one. It's interesting. I mean, it's, I don't know, because it's both, isn't it? Because it is Shakespeare, and it's a much-loved Shakespeare, so a lot of people use it, but it's populated by this cast, these people, his style. You know, I think it's an interesting one, and I was interested because you raised earlier that, you know, Avengers is the interesting thing that he's walked into, and it exists in him. He's done the same thing with Shakespeare. He's walked into Shakespeare and is appropriating Shakespeare, so I don't know. I mean, I would say it's got elements of both, because I think it's going to attract people from those two groups who are going to read it knows what is.
Shakespeare's the bigger pocket.
What will be interesting to see is how well received it is outside of Whedon fans, you know, as an adaptation of Shakespeare. You know how people, because to be honest, the only people I've known, I know who've seen it, are Whedon fans. So I don't have that perspective yet of what people think about it beyond that, and whether it will function the way that the Avengers clearly has, you know, is both a Whedon, we see the Whedon in it, but it stands on its own. But will this be seen as a Whedon text because it's in his house, you know, it's his books on the shelf, you know. Any other questions?
Should we have maybe more?
Yes, we have wine, but can we just take one last opportunity to thank all of our speakers for a really interesting panel discussion.
To your next competition.
So yeah, give me my guess. So you're Roehampton at the time?
From the University of Hawaii.
Yeah, and it's
well, yeah, that's the idea.
very excited. Really?
Although the idea of putting it in volume is
no, exactly. It's already there. It works so well.
basically kind of
I agree. No, I agree. I mean,
I'm sure it is, but what would it be? Pencil cases.
Actually,